A quick disclaimer before we begin. This episode contains discussion of what is arguably the most upsetting topic there is. My guest today devoted his life to protecting the most innocent and vulnerable members of our society from its worst monsters. The details of that work and the toll it took on him are disturbing, to say the least. As Lori and I tried to figure out why I was successful in getting confessions and closing cases, we decided it was because I cared and had empathy. I gave something of myself, and others gave back to me in return. I am not a social worker or someone who believes everyone is redeemable. I just know that on some occasions, I was able to get through to someone, which enabled us to recover victims, answer anguished questions, and prevent others from being harmed. For me, the pain of both the crimes and the confessions live within me. That is an excerpt from In the Name of the Children, an FBI agent's pursuit of America's worst predators by Jeffrey Rinek. Jeffrey spent 3 decades hunting child predators and at least one serial killer as an FBI agent and profiler based in Sacramento, California, where he pioneered a new empathy-based approach to interviewing suspects. He recently appeared in Season 4 of the podcast Serial. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Jeff, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Charlie.
Boy, your book was a powerful read.
Thank you.
A lot of darkness and some light in there, too. I would recommend it.
Thank you.
Well, I want to ask you a question about questions. The thing that made me want to talk to you was that you've obviously applied the trade of interviewing in some high stakes, high intensity situations. But those insights, I think, probably apply to anyone who is talking to people for a living and asking questions. What makes a really good question?
For me, it's not one question. For me, it's a curiosity. Questions are how we express curiosity. I believe that everybody has value. Even when you drive down the street under a bridge and there's a person there begging, that person has value because they're surviving in that environment. I couldn't tell you that I could survive in that environment. So love the fact that everybody knows something. And I'm curious about people. I love to learn about people. But there's this thing in me that when I know someone's not doing well or suffering, I want to help them. I want them to feel better. And so when I interview people or I'm talking to people, if you can believe it, the hardest interviews are not the offenders, it's the victims. And when you're talking to whoever, I go by what interests me, and what interests me is the person I'm talking to. I think you experienced that a little bit just now when we were preparing to do our podcast. I like to know your background, your family, things about, not because I'm using it to get a confession. It's because I'm genuinely interested and want to know. So if you share something with me that expresses pain on your end, for instance, let's say growing up, there was a person in your life that was identified as being an offender. I'm interested in how you did with that. How did that affect you? How did it affect your family? And then when you ask for these things, I always give. So when I talk to people, I'm not hesitant to tell them about my background or my life or the things that went bad for me. And I found that when people talk, they like to share. And if I share things, then they share things. And then the next thing you know, we're sharing things together. I don't like to start with, if it's an offender I'm interviewing, I don't like to start with, did you do it? Why did you do it? When did you think about it? I don't know. I'm like, they tell me their name and we start talking. An example, I was interviewing a 19-year-old boy who had murdered a 15-year-old boy. And for reasons that I don't want to, waste your podcast for, this boy had ended up asking for me to talk to him. And when I did, and we started talking, we started talking about him, where did you grow up, your parents, whatever. And then eventually, it's important to know what people want, what they care about, what they think about. And in this case, I asked this young man, if you could have anything in the world, what would you want? He said, I would want someone to love me, and I would want someone to love. Now that says a lot. And now from him saying that, I can not only understand him a little better, but it helps me relate to him because, of course, there's situations in my life where I feel that way. And that's how you join together in an emotional way. And then once you have that, then you can start talking about the hard things because and some people will judge me for this, but it's not just the hard things. The hard things I'm talking about is hard things for you too, you know. And so when Lori talks about me coming home and feeling the need to cry or break down, it's because of what I gave up. It's because of what I felt. We had an interesting experience a few years ago. A close friend of ours, his daughter was assaulted. And when he called, Lori got really upset with me because I was asking questions like a doctor would ask questions about a disease. That's clinical Jeff, you know. That's the Jeff that goes to the crime scenes. But underneath that is this whole emotional Jeff that can't believe what I'm seeing. My God, it's surreal and all that. And that's when everything is under control and in hand. I start thinking about what I just experienced, and that's when the pain comes in.
For the people at home, I mean, you and I had a time set to record this, and we ended up just chatting away like you're describing. And I mean, I'm having you on because I have questions for you, and then I was almost embarrassed because of how interested you were in my life. It's wonderful conversation.
It's fascinating to me. And I'll think about it. We don't just, click off and I go on my merry way. I'll be thinking about the fact that, you live in Ireland and I've never met a person who does ghostwriting before. And I think that's fascinating. And the fact that you're successful at it is even, what makes you successful at ghostwriting? So you've got to have some of that in you as well.
Well, I mean, you said something there that I think was really interesting because I don't purport to be like an expert in interviewing, but one thing I know I do right is, and I attribute this to ADHD because and same with editing. I'm a good editor because I'm not a good reader and I get bored
Uh-huh.
really easily. So if a book has failed to capture my attention, I'll start to feel that right away. And in an interview, already antsy and I don't want to sit down and I'm jumping out of my skin. The minute someone says something that's a little more interesting than what they've been saying, I'll be inclined to throw away my prepared interview and follow them down what they really want to talk about. And I think that can be very useful in storytelling because you're not going to write a good book with just a kind of paint by numbers set of questions that you stick to at all costs.
Agreed. And to follow up on that, sometimes Lori goes crazy with me because when I give a presentation about a case or even this, I don't write it out. I don't have an outline. You get me as I am at that moment. And do that because I think everybody, every audience deserves the respect and honor that you care about them enough to be able to share yourself with them, just like you do on an individual level, you do it on a mass level. I have, emoted in my presentations and I think everybody deserves to get you the way you are and not the way you prepare yourself.
As a ghostwriter, your job is to bring that out of someone. And while I'm not trying to get someone to confess to a crime, or it's not even investigative journalism because I can't use something a client or an author doesn't want me to put in their book, right? We're on the same side of the table. But a lot of times the best book for them, like their book will be best served by me getting them to talk about something they didn't think they wanted to talk about, or that they were whether they were kind of putting on a front and performing and sharing what they think is the interesting part or what have you. And that can be so critical. And I'm wondering, because you've done this in an evidence gathering capacity, I mean, how do you then go from that empathy moment to getting someone to maybe share something that isn't strictly in their best interest to verbalize?
Well, first of all, let me predicate what I say, my belief that a person who is a psychopath, in my opinion, does not have the capability of feeling emotion. Dr. Robert Hare, in his book Without Conscience, says that some people are born without the ability to feel emotion. I believe in that. So if I'm talking to a person who doesn't have emotions, it won't matter that much to them. But when I am talking to someone who does care, does have emotion, I believe that whatever they did, whatever they're accused of doing, was done for a benefit that either they don't understand, they do understand. But I do believe, because I believe in the good of people and I believe in people's value. I think when I talk about with subjects I'm interviewing, I talk about the benefit that they have the ability to give. They have the ability to give a gift. And the gift is knowledge and understanding. And I have seen, for instance, where you have victim families that lose a loved one, and the one word constantly coming from them is why. The extent that we can help them understand the why, we help them. And the understanding, the answer to that why, can only come from the person you're talking to. So I believe that the person you're talking to has the ability to give a very valuable gift. And by doing that, they have the ability to increase their value even after they've done such a valueless thing. And I believe that most people will talk to me about these things because they want to feel better, just like the victim family wants to feel better.
Hmm. And it makes sense logically. The surface level, first glance version is that you're dealing with someone who's irredeemable, or people are like, I'd be inclined to conflate what this person has to say with what they've done. And it sounds like, am I right in understanding that you have found a way to separate those things for the possibility of a useful exchange?
Okay, so I wouldn't describe it as separating these things. I think they're all part of one big framework. For instance, I'm trying to think of an example from my case experience. And I guess the easiest one for people to understand would be concerning Kerry Stayner in the Yosemite case. And there came a time where I did not know what he had done and was thrown together with me in a day where we were both having to be with each other to accomplish something that was set out by another person. And I wanted to be home with my wife. He didn't want to be riding in an FBI car with me going for an interview. So we're both kind of thrown together, stuck together. And during that, we get to know each other. So when we got to the FBI office and that point at which he would have to either decide to talk about what he had done or continue to hide it, he was confronted with a choice. And his choice was because of what we had shared together, because he knew me and I had shared things with him. He, instead of submitting to a polygraph examination, asked to speak to me alone. And when I went in to see him after he was placed in a room by himself, and I went in to see him, he started out by saying, "I am a terrible person. I'm a bad person. I've done bad things." And my response to that is the response I feel. It's the response I have for everyone. You may have done bad things, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person or a terrible person. We need to discover and understand why you did what you did. Now, his lawyers convinced him this was a big routine that I did, and I set him up. It wasn't. I was being very honest with him. And what we went through is understanding what it was in his life, so much desperation and anxiety that he committed these crimes. And I explained to him my belief that by having this discussion and talking about this and trying to understand it, at one point we'd be able to help the victim families, and therefore he had the ability to help others. And I think with that approach is you're telling someone who feels that they don't have value that there is a pathway to value, and that pathway to value and feeling better about yourself is to talk about what you've done. So it's not so much confession knowing they're going to get locked up. It's a confession trying to feel better. It's like the Barbara Walters of the FBI.
I almost threw that in your interview, and I forgot where I heard that. I didn't want to misquote anybody, but am I right that you have been called that?
I haven't been called that. What happens with me is that my partner, his name was Ken Hipmeyer, his big joke about me, which was accurate, that if you got an offender and you send me in to interview the offender, we'll both come out crying. And that's pretty accurate. And that's pretty much the way it works. And what people don't understand is that when we're going through this, like when I went through it with Carrie, it wasn't in my mind what was going to happen in terms of the trial and the death penalty and all that. What was going through my mind was totally, how do I make them feel better? How do I make these victim families feel better? And so when afterwards, when normal things cut back in and the criminal process moves forward, yeah, I do have this sense of what have I done? And that's one of the reasons, that I have emotional difficulties is because I'm not proud of myself because of what I caused in his life, but I am proud of myself for helping him understand what he did. In Kerry Stainer's case, and this is just my opinion, I don't know that anyone would agree with it, but I spent 6 or 7 hours with Kerry Stainer. Oh, actually more than that, but 6 or 7 hours was the interview. And during that time, sat with me, my partner, John Bowles, who sat in on the interview. He saw how we interacted and how we feel about each other. He saw how we interacted with other people. And I think he liked that. That's something he wanted for himself. And to feel that sense of value of acceptance, that's a big deal. We didn't orchestrate for him to feel this way. It's just what happened. But as the interview went on, I could see and sense he was feeling. Asked him if he felt better. He said he did. And the way that I demonstrate the fact that he felt a lot of relief is, if you can believe it, that night after he was logged into the Sacramento County Main Jail, a news journalist went to see him, and he confessed to the news journalist. Now, he didn't confess to the embarrassing things or the very sensitive things, but he told the news journalist everything he had done. And I think that his willingness to talk about it reflected the relief he felt that now he could talk about it. And he wasn't carrying this burden of what he had done, which is, I don't think, a burden anyone can live with unless you don't have emotion. And that's the way I feel. That's the way I approach it.
I mean, back to like the lighter side of helping somebody write a book. This sounds what I've find very familiar in that story is I have had situations, because the way the ghostwriting process works, there's kind of a period of usually a couple weeks of talking every single day and doing extensive interviews, and it's on to the writing, where I wouldn't have as much direct contact, at least while I'm drafting something. And I've had a couple of authors I've worked with basically be like, kind of, they don't always say it like this, but they miss talking every day, and they miss being able to just say what's on their mind. And I've always described it as a real privilege and an honor to hear someone's stories. And it never ceases to amaze me how I've kind of done two kinds of books. I've done ones that deal in like heavy duty trauma, and then like business how-to books. But in the business how-to books, there will always be some interview where someone kind of will say to me, even my family doesn't know this, but, and it's often something that doesn't make it into the book, shouldn't be in the book, whatever. But it's like, while I have you, I'm gonna share something.
Yes, yes. And I experienced that too. I mean, there's a funny story here. It's not really funny, but it's different, that Lori and I were doing work on our house, and we were getting deliveries of stone and stuff. And one of the drivers came up, dropped the stone, and then we stood out there. So imagine this from Lori's perspective. She's standing in the living room of our house. She sees me out there with this guy. It goes on and on and on. And then the guy gives me this big bear hug, gets in his truck, and emotionally, he drives away. So, of course, you don't want to get in there. What was that about? Well, it turned out that the guy himself was an offender, a child offender. And he had done his time. And we were talking about it. And I talked about it just the way I have discussed it. And I think he felt a tremendous sense of relief that he found someone he could talk about it with and not judge him. And in fact, he said to me, which was remarkable and 100% accurate, that he lives his life staying away from children because he doesn't trust himself, just like an alcoholic would stay away from alcohol, or a drug user. And I said to him, that is a perfect strategy. And I think it's great. And I think it's great that you realize this about yourself. And because of that, you've added value to not only yourself, but to the people you meet. I mean, he started crying, and it was very emotional for him to be able to, I guess, shed this weight, or know that there was someone out there who wasn't going to want to kill him. And so when he left, he gave me the big hug. He just sobbing, he gave me a hug, drove away. And that's what I told Lori. And I've had that experience several times where people tell me things, know what it is about me that causes that. In the book, in the first case, Frankie Proctor, after Greg Stewart, the detective from SAC PD, got Frankie back, the neighborhood down there, which was, kind of like a gang neighborhood, I think, had a party for the police department and the FBI. They had a block party for law enforcement. I've never heard of such a thing, but we all went. All my guns, but we went. And we were drinking beer, and we were having a wonderful time because people are people. And we were all enjoying each other's company. In the middle of this, Charlie, I'm sitting there, and some guy comes over, sits next to me, and wants to confess his drug dealing. And so, everybody freezes, and I've got a beer in my hand, and I'm a little shocked. And I looked over at him because everybody was looking at me, and I said, look, I am off duty. I'm drinking a beer. I don't want to hear about your drug dealing. Go tell somebody else, and, goodbye. And then, and all these guys are like, yeah, yeah. And I think the moral of the story is that people want to shed their emotional weight so they can feel better about it. And all I am is a valve that lets them do that. But a valve that cares, I care. Lori used to get, I used to get Christmas cards from people in prison. I mean, even now, I mean, I don't. I can go on and on. I'll stop there.
No, I mean, that's incredible.
You know, but one of the things that evolved from this is that in 2003, when I started working in the book, it's the chapter, the 22. That was one of the first times for me that I was dealing with victims that were still alive. I had not thought of that, had not considered it. It never occurred to me. And when I dropped the one boy off at the airport and I'm driving home, I had to pull over and call Lori, and I'm ready to cry now. I mean, I broke down crying to think of what he had lived through. And we're talking about what he had lived through was so bad that what made him happy would be something that you and I would never tolerate, just to be talked to without being hit or beat or God knows what. And it just broke my heart. But the thing I'm building to is that I'm in touch with all these children. Lori and I are like their distant parents. I won't say which chapter. You think I should say which chapter? There's one chapter in the book where a family member found me after 20 years. And now we are kind of like parents to this person. And this person wrote us and told us how much we meant to her. And so the reality of dealing with the damage in a living person put a whole new level of emotional anguish for me on it, because I wasn't dealing with a child who was dead, and I didn't have to worry about the child, what they were experiencing. I was dealing with children that were alive. And I mean, there was one point where some of these kids were living together and they didn't have the money for their apartment. So Lori gave me the okay, and I went over to the apartment manager and I said, don't evict them, we'll pay their rent. And so things like this, how much weight like this can build up in one person without pushing that person under. And I think that's the way it happened to me. And all the things I'm talking about, all these things that were, I didn't talk about them before, Charlie. I talk about these things now to honor my family, to honor Lori, my two sons, because what I put them through, which I didn't know at the time, I know now. And I believe in my life, I will never, ever be able to make it up to them. I remember things in video form. I don't know how you are, but when I video the crime scenes or videos that run in my head, and I have some of those videos in my head of my interaction with my wife and my sons. And I will live the rest of my life believing that I caused things that I'll never be able to overcome. And it bothers me.
I mean, that I think it's so easy to focus on some of the horror in your book. I mean, the 22, that chapter you described, I think it took me like 3 days to read that chapter because it was just I could only take so much at once. I found it uniquely upsetting. But the 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 story of your family really comes through, and even just now, I mean, you come back to Lori, and as a reader, it was kind of good to know there's a happy ending in your life. But I'm wondering, there's a lot of people who compartmentalize and they don't take their work home, or they don't talk about it, or they think they can't talk about it, or they don't want to burden their family. The list goes on. I mean, there's some people in my family who've done amazing things, and we don't know a lot of the details because they didn't talk to the now living spouse about their work. But when did you know that you could share these things, and that it was okay to do so? Was it always something you were comfortable sharing at home?
No, no. In my case, it was a choice of sharing these things or losing my family, especially Lori. When I tell you that I wake up every day to be with my wife, I am not exaggerating. If she weren't here, I wouldn't be here. She is the essence of my life. She makes me want to wake up every day. And the things that she's been through with me, that I put her through, I'll never know. I don't even know what to say. I do know this. I've caused trauma for her. In the book, I describe my tendency to want to end my life. In one of those situations to this day, if there is a similar scene we see on TV or somewhere, it sets her off. Just like seeing these things will set me off. So for the rest of our lives, we live knowing that without any warning, we're going to see something that sets us off. There was Clint Eastwood did a movie, I think it was called Flags of Our Fathers. And at the end of the movie, one of the surviving Marines went to see the mother of his friend who had been captured by the Japanese, brought underground, and just tortured and murdered in such a heinous way as to not be emotional. And they show him, I'm going to set myself up. They show him going into the mom, and he shows him telling the mom a story that is not reflective of what really happened. It was a story that she could live with. And that reminded me of situations I've been in with some of the children. I've had parents ask me how their children have died, and I don't think I have the ability to describe what I've seen. So I think this is in the book, and I think I can talk about it, is that with Joey Armstrong's mother, Leslie, she was not aware of the progression of her daughter's death. And when Lori and we took our older son, Joe, we had to go to the preliminary hearing for the Yosemite case in Mariposa. She saw us and found us and said that she didn't know how her daughter died. So we took her down to our room. Lori and Joe left, and I was alone with her, and she wanted to know how her daughter died. So I asked her that if Joey were alive and you gave her a choice of continuing life, but others would die, or giving up her life, but others would live, what would she choose? And she said that Joey would choose to give up her life to save others. And so I spent the remaining time with her explaining to her that that is how her daughter died. She died, and that her zest and love of life caused Kerry Stainer to leave behind all the evidence that caused him to be the suspect in her daughter's case. It ended up being what caused me to end up with him and getting the confession, so that when she thinks about her daughter's death, she should think that there are people walking around today that owe their life to Joey and don't know it. And as far as I was concerned, I was Joey's tool, and that was it. I had no greater meaning than being Joey's tool. And I also said the same thing to Kerry Stainer's parents, is that he chose the light over the dark. He chose to confess. He chose me to be the tool through which he confessed, to stop himself. And by doing that, wouldn't kill others. So this is what's important to me, because everybody looks for meaning in what's happened. And I think that the meaning is the memory that we take with us.
Wow. I mean, I won't go overly into it, but what you were saying about the traumatizing effect of a sanitized version of events, that was a big thing for my dad, talking about his experiences in war and the feeling that it was wrong to lie to widows and mothers, but it was also wrong to tell them what had really happened. There's a chapter in his book where that's he felt too that his citation for the Silver Star was more of the same. It was the Department of the Navy's version talking about this brave Marine and blah blah blah. And he had a chance in a book to say what they would never be able to put in a citation.
Charlie, Lori's uncle, Uncle Jim, was in the second wave at D-Day.
Wow.
He had never talked about his war experience. Never. A few months before he died, we were all sitting together for a family occasion, and out of nowhere, he told me what he had done. Why did he do that? And I could see in him the pain, regret, but also the knowledge that he did what he had to do. And because of it, he was a patriot. He was a valuable person in our society. I don't know if that helped at all, because what he experienced is so far beyond anything I can imagine in my life. But I don't know why he did that. And people do that. I don't know why people do that with me. But I do feel that when they do, it's an honor. And I have an obligation not only acknowledge it as an honor, but to respect it.
Yeah, I think there's a reason various spiritual traditions and religions use the term like bearing witness to what you're
Yes,
describing.
exactly. Now, one thing I'd like to say, because Lori's sitting here, and if I don't say it, she'll beat me up when we're done. There is, I do have an interview plan when, if someone is going to tell me their story and we're going to discuss what they did, I do have certain things I want to cover. And for your listeners who write these stories, I don't know if it will help them, but it might be good for them to hear what I do. So in Kerry Steiner's case, we had agreed that he was going to account for Joey's death, and then he was going to describe to us what he did with the Carol, Julie, and Raquel. I'm sorry, Sylvina. Raquel's her mom. And so what I do is this. First, I asked Kerry to give me kind of like a abbreviated version of what he remembers. So it's kind of like an outline for a story, if you will. And that outline serves to help guide me to what he's going to be talking about. Then we go back, and this time I am also asking questions. And the first, I don't want to call it a level, but the first goal is to learn everything from his senses that he remembers: his sight, his smell, his touch, what he heard. I want to know everything from him. For instance, when did you start feeling you were going to do this? When did you decide you were going to do this? What did you do to prepare for this? And then when we get to the actual crime, what did you see? How did you see them react? What did they say to you? And so that's that. We complete that, and then we go back again, this time because I want to know what the victim felt, what the victim heard, what the victim saw, because he, by virtue of being the killer, is the last one who can tell us what the victim experienced. And for me, that's invaluable. I want to know. We can give life back to that victim for a short period of time of knowing what they did. A lot of times in homicide, I don't know about other guys, but for me, I look at the offender's face and I think to myself, that was the last thing the victim saw before they lost consciousness. And because of that, I want to know, what else did the victim see? Then we finish that way. Then we go back again, this time from a perspective of, I'm standing in the room. What do I see you doing with these victims? We go through it again in detail. And then finally, when we're done, I learned from Greg Stewart of Sacramento Police Department that when watched him get a confession in the Frankie Proctor case. And at the end, he asked for the offender to write a letter of apology to Frankie. And I thought that was brilliant. And ever since I saw him do that, I included it myself. So then I asked for him to write a letter. In Kerry's case, he would only write a letter to Julie's son and to no one else. So that's a clue for me, how he feels about what he did. And when he did write the letter, use that letter when he allocated in federal court, it's all about him. This, I, that, me, that. And so, people who commit crimes are selfish. It's the ultimate selfish thing you can do is to kill or hurt or inconvenience or maim or injure someone for something you want. That and so that's what you learn from the letter of apology. And also, I've never seen a letter of apology that didn't demonstrate to me that I missed something in the interview by what they said. We had a case in West Sacramento where a little girl accidentally fell into a rice silo and died. Her friends were scared. Her friends were scared because of what happened. They were afraid to say what happened. So instead of reporting it as her falling in by accident, they reported it that an offender took her. And eventually, it was determined and everything. But when the West Sacramento detective, her name was Martha Barbosa, unbelievable. I asked Martha, ask him to write a letter of apology. His letter of apology was a picture of a scaffolding with him hanging. And that told her that we needed to keep an eye on him and get him help. So those are the things, those are examples of, you can never stop learning or discovering new things with a letter of apology.
Well, man, those are great. And I think when I share this podcast, I'm going to put together those steps of your interview process because I think that would help people. A lot of people have questions about the formal structure of interviewing.
I never considered what I did as a interview technique. What I did was what I did because it was a Jeff technique. It was Jeff. And Lori was the one who was identifying it as this could help other people conduct better interviews. And she's over here. You got to understand, Lori cannot be silent when I'm talking. So while I'm talking to you, I'm getting this second channel of information in my ear. And what happens is what I'm trying to say, and when she's telling me clash, and I forget everything I'm going to say, sometimes I forget my name. So what she wants me to make sure I tell you is that the most accepted interview technique in current day law enforcement is the Reed technique. Have you looked it up?
Well, I remember from your book, it was summarize it, and it's pretty astonishing from like a civil liberties point of view.
Not only the Reed technique is not only a technique used to gain confession, but I think a lot of polygraph examiners use it with their polygraph examinations. I'm not here to comment on whether it works or it doesn't work. I am here to say that I've dealt with situations where the Reed technique has produced confessions that weren't true. And sometimes the Reed technique can cause people to feel so much pressure and anxiety that they'll do anything to escape it. Just like the pressure and anxiety they're feeling from the crime they committed, you add that to the pressure and anxiety that's instilled in them from an interview, especially if the interviewer is particularly overbearing or is like Andre the Giant, the person's going to say whatever they have to get out of that room. So I didn't see myself doing that. I don't feel myself capable of doing that. So what's happened with me is my curiosity and desire to learn about people and appreciate people's value just kind of merged with, these steps I take to learn about what they've done. And then we get, I think, we get a pretty good idea of what's happened. As I said, and the important thing is too, Charlie, is that as great as this sounds, it's hardest on a victim. A victim is the hardest person to get to talk because they are humiliated by what happened to them. They feel responsible and they feel that it reflects their value and their value is zero. I believe when you look at a gorgeous woman like Lori Rinek and you say to yourself, what the fuck is she doing with that guy? You're seeing a woman who's got no sense of self value. So she thinks an idiot like me is the person she wants to spend her life with. So, when you see women that are prostitutes or engaged in some self humiliating job, you're looking at a person that thinks they have no value, and that's how they express it. I'm going to do this because, who cares about me?
Mm.
And my point, the message I have for everyone is you do have value, and you should never settle for that. So that's kind of.
Wow. Well, there was something I was determined to share on this podcast, and it's something that I've not talked about it publicly on one other occasion. And when I shared this, somebody came up to me and said, you need to keep talking about that because you never know who this story might help. And everything you and I have talked about in relation to the kind of crimes you've worked on would be academic and kind of something that lives in the pages of books. If it wasn't for an experience I had a few years ago, I won't go into a lot of detail just for anonymity and whatnot, but there was someone in my life who was a mentor and someone I really looked up to in a very, very vulnerable time for me, who it turned out was leading a total double life as a predator and a sex offender of involved in abuse images of children. And it was, and this guy he was married. He had a life that looked like something really desirable and something I aspired to at a time when, talk about not having self-worth, I was really in a low point in my life and being helped by this person. And I bring it up because I there's so much in your book where you talk about the people who are affected by these crimes, whether it's families and friends of victims or families and friends of perpetrators. I can remember at the time, first of all, I didn't want to talk about it with anyone. I didn't want to talk about anything with anyone. I just totally withdrew. But I can remember at the time, I did some reading up on what people go through, whether it's spouses, friends, etc., when someone turns out to have this going on. There were some things that were kind of universal, and I'll mention them now, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. The first was that my feeling that I didn't want to make friends again ever was pretty normal and could last for a little while because of that sense of, well, who else can't I trust? Who else seems okay but isn't? I felt a lot of guilt. Like, were there signs that if I had seen them, I could have stopped some of what he did or whatever? What did it say about me that I had a friend like this? And then I also felt guilty for feeling guilty because what I experienced couldn't begin to compare what his family was going through or what his victims and their families were going through. And then, it was a case of like the big bad wolf is actually at the door and the boogeyman is real and all these things that, I knew this kind of crime existed, but it existed on Law and Order and in books. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I know that reading your book helped me, many years later understand. I guess my first question, I read somewhere there weren't really any signs for me to see. This wasn't like a drug addict or an alcoholic where there would be clear evidence of this behavior in his demeanor or what have you.
Well, if you're asking me if there's a way of being able to predict or identify offenders, before they harm you, my response is going to be that is a question that has as many variations as pi. You can't, I think the better way to look at it is to ask yourself how you feel about yourself because you're friends with this person. If you were standing at, let's say, in the wolf's lair in World War II with Hitler, how would you feel about yourself? And so, what I'm suggesting to you or saying to you is that when we say a person occupies a position of trust and confidence, that's something that they consciously earn. They know they're occupied. Some people deliberately earn that position because their intentions are to use that position. Other people find themselves in that position because of they may at heart be a good person and just, you know, the world is kind of seeing that right now in New York with the arrest of the P. Diddy, I think his name. Here's a person who's, in my opinion, from what I've seen, and this is just my opinion, but based on what I've seen, this is a guy whose entire motivation is centered around his sexual desires. And then you look at his sexual desires and you try and determine. So what I'm trying to say is if some beautiful woman met Sean P. Diddy Combs and he spends hundreds of thousands of dollars on them, she's going to think he's great. She's going to think he values her. That's what we call grooming. When one person goes overboard to prove to another person how much they think about them, that's called grooming. And so you have to ask yourself, were you groomed? The person that you're discussing and talking about, was this person the person in your life the way you felt about them because they wanted to be? Did they intend it to be? Or did it just happen that way and they took advantage of the situation the way it was? But in any regard, Charlie, and this is the message that I have for me too, is if you make a poor judgment, it doesn't mean you have no value. It doesn't mean your value can be questioned. And it doesn't mean you should be looking at yourself in a way that somehow lessens your presence because you didn't see this, so you made this mistake. People that commit offenses deliberately set themselves to prevent you from recognizing what they're doing. So are you going to blame yourself for something they're doing? I don't think so. Do you feel responsible for the assaults this friend of yours committed? I don't think so. So you're looking at this person and what they did, and it's so heinous. It's so outside anything you could consider tolerable that you're saying to yourself, how can I have been associated with this person and not know this? How can this person be doing these things and I not have any idea it's happening? And the answer to that, Charlie, is that you're a good person and we don't go around in our lives looking for these behaviors or people doing this. And all you did was be a friend. Now, once you learn what they've done or what they're engaged in and how they're doing it, that is where you say, all right, I didn't know this, whether you caused this to happen on purpose or not, I have to determine. But any way you look at it, it's not your fault. It doesn't reflect you in any way, shape, or form. When a person is victimized, they feel humiliated because they feel like they should have known, or they're embarrassed that their judgment was so bad. That's why I said the hardest statements to come by are from victims. And so what I'm saying to you, Charlie, is that why are you blaming yourself for something you didn't do and something you had no knowledge of and something that was existed on the other side of the world for all you know? You have to let that go. And what you say to yourself is, thank goodness you found out when you did. Thank goodness you have the value, the strength, the inner workings to say, that's not for me. And if that person is going to be that way, That's not a person that's going to be in my life because I'm better than that. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. Yeah. And it's yeah, it hits in a
When
very real way. Yes.
when you, in my opinion, child victims always think they always take responsibility. They always do what the adult won't do. They'll say they'll take responsibility. They may not express it or whatever, but somehow they'll feel that what happened to them was their fault. And they'll also feel that what happened to them is a reflection that they have no value, that they're worthless. And that, when I'm interviewing a child like that, that's what hurts me the worst, because I want that child to understand that's not the case. So my oldest son had a friend who was dating a girl. And out of nowhere, this girl wanted to talk to me alone. So I wasn't going to talk to her alone. So I brought my younger son and told him to keep an eye on me. And we met on a park bench. And when I met her, she said, I want you to do for me what you did for my friend, this guy. And I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, well, I want you to help me. And what happened was she proceeded to go on and tell me that her father had been assaulting her since she was a little girl, and she wanted it to stop. And she wanted to find a way in her life that she could live with the knowledge that this happened and not have it make her feel the way it was making her feel. So we talked about responsibility and value. Then she told me she had a younger sister, and I suggested to her that her father was doing it to a younger sister. Absolutely not. She would tell me. I would know. She would tell me, not happen. So the arrangement I made with her is, I'd like to meet with your little sister. And if this isn't happening, we'll find. So I met with the little sister in a coffee shop. And the first thing she said to me was, my father's not doing anything to me. I'm good. Everything's fine. Everything's good. So I said to her, can I ask you two questions? Just two questions, and then we'll be done. She goes, yeah. I said, when you sleep at night, do you have nightmares that you're free falling and just falling and falling and falling and falling? And her eyes turned red. I could see the tears starting to well up in her eyes. The second question was, do you ever feel that you're constricted and can't move? And then when I said that, she lost it. And it turned out her father had been assaulting her just like he'd been assaulting the older one. The thing is, here we have one victim wanting to deal with her victimization, recognizing it. We have another one who wants to believe nothing bad happened. And so in both cases, they both took responsibility and they both felt it reflected their value. And that's what we as adults have to tell them. Just a birthday party for my sons, I had to go to, and there was a boy there. And apparently the boy had been assaulted in a park by a guy. And you could see he wasn't doing well. And I couldn't help myself. I went up, how are you? Are you okay? I heard what happened. And he started crying and he started crying. And I'm like, tell me, what is it? And what it was with him was, when he got home, his father put him in the car along with a loaded weapon and had him drive around the area where he'd been assaulted, looking for the guy that did the assault, because his father was going to kill him on the spot. And his father was angry beyond description. And when he's telling me this, he's breaking down and crying. And I said, what did you want your father to do? He said, I just wanted my father to hug me and tell me everything was all right and he still loved me. And that broke me down, but it taught me probably one of the most valuable lessons I learned. And that was that these children that have been harmed, it's up to us to show them it's not their fault. It's not their value. And the best way to do that is to reaffirm our love and to reaffirm our commitment to them and our commitment to how valuable they are. And so these are all things that you learn on the job, that I learned from dealing with these people. And they they pretty much dictate how I um, handle myself with people in general. I mean, it's not just lessons to be applied on the job; it's lessons to live by.
Because I think part of it, when I step back and look at that self-care angle that you're describing, I think the thing that I had the hardest time with, and I feel the same way. I live in Ireland where there was mass institutional victimization for generations through the church of almost everybody. And when I hear stories like that, it's in the same category of like, I can understand it like intellectually, right? In the same way you'd understand atrocities in history. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. And problem, I think, sometimes when we're confronted with just something that's just stupefyingly awful is it can make us think there's nothing that could possibly be done about it. And you mentioned love, which I mean, I love that answer. And obviously, you have had, in some ways, the fortune and privilege to be able to confront this problem in a professional capacity. For those of us in just society who want to do something helpful, I mean, is there anything to be done? I mean, there's one thing I'm aware of where the FBI and Interpol will release like images to try to geolocate things. I've called trace an object on Reddit. And these are not explicit for people at home. It's like, say it'd be a picture of a bookshelf and with no context, and someone might be able to figure out exactly where that was purchased, and it could, who knows, it could save a kid or something. Is there anything else or anything that comes to mind that people could do to be helpful?
I think people being helpful in cases like this is a very dangerous proposition because I can tell you that I wasn't strong enough to not let it affect me. And if you take a person who's dealing with this and has no experience, it has a tendency to turn people into something they're not. So, first of all, my first suggestion is hug your children and let them know that you'll always love them. Nothing will ever change. There's a message also out there. There's a lot of parents out there, moms, who know or believe or suspect that their boyfriend or their husband is doing something with their children. Those are the ones that can help. And they need to come forward and they need to meet with a law enforcement officer and they need to report it and report the person. When you read the chapter in the book on the 22, both those women not only didn't do that, but they participated with their husbands in assaulting the children. There's nothing that could be worse in my mind is, we look to our parents for everything that's good. And here you have your parents participating in things that are harming you. So I don't think it's a good thing for, I'm going to say vigilantism because
Sure, that comes to mind. Yeah.
this is one subject matter where a person who is as calm and peaceful as can be turned into a killer because of what you've already noticed. That it's so bad. It's so beyond description. It's so life affecting. I don't think it's healthy for anyone to be exposed to this that doesn't need to be exposed to it. But at the same time, anyone who suspects it or has reason to believe, not just like, oh, I don't like that guy, so he's a child molester, but someone like, as an example, in my own job, I had one of my coworkers come up to me and say, this woman I know thinks her husband is watching her daughters in the shower. And I said, well, how does she know that? Well, she found a hole in the ceiling. And it turns out that it was someone, a family member. But anyway, if a woman sees that, or a brother or sister sees that, they got to come forward and go to police and say, look, or go to someone they trust. I'll give one more example, Charlie. I don't want to be, this like hours and hours of what I've been through. There was a little girl, 12-year-old girl, whose father was an over-the-road truck driver. And her father took her with him in that truck going over. She was studying geology at the time, and she was noting every state she was in when her father assaulted her. When we got her, she had noted 35 states. She stopped in Sacramento with her father, and she told her aunt, and her aunt told law enforcement, and we got involved, all of us. And when it comes to children, there's no turf wars, there's no competition between law enforcement. We all work together for the benefit of this little girl. And we ended up, they asked me to do the interview of her, and everybody observed. And so we all sort of, and you know, I'm not great. I mean, if I do an interview, I'm expecting people observing me to tell me where I'm screwing up or what I can do better. And so we did that with her, and it was very revealing. And as a result, federal charges were brought against him. And when he went to trial, the first day of his trial, he stood up and he said, I confess, I'm guilty. I don't want to go through this trial. And so a little while later, we have an allocution where he comes in and tells the judge what he did, and the judge. So I went to that, and I sat there. Well, when this girl had reported everything, everyone in her family was like, she was like the star. Everybody wanted to be there for her. Unfortunately, sometimes this turns into people who want attention will be with the person who's getting the attention, which isn't healthy. But nevertheless, they came in the courtroom. I was sitting here by myself. She had this entourage of family and social workers. And she left them and came over and sat with me, which my heart leaped. It just really made me feel good. And then when her father started talking, she started crying. God, she was sobbing. Everybody in the courtroom could see it. And I said to her, look, if your father starts out with, or what he says is me, or anything like that, you're not permitted to cry. If it is your father says you or your name, you can cry. She never cried again. And the ultimate honor she gave me is that when I retired from the job, the newspaper did a little thing on me, and she wrote to the reporter and told her what I had done for her. That doesn't get any better. I mean, that's what I live for. I live for the ability to help these victims feel better and their families to feel better. That's what I care about the most. So what I'm saying in answer to your question is, I don't think people should be out there hunting offenders, and especially if they get the wrong one.
Oh yeah.
How are you going to live with that? So I think you stay within your circle of friends and family. But if you notice something is not right, or you have reason to believe something's not right, something that's demonstrable to another person, then you need to go forward and tell the authorities so they can stop it and get this to society, out of society. That's what I believe.
There you go. That and, hug your kids. Um,
With your kids.
Thank you so much. I want to close with a question that I actually got from your book, and I have like stolen this. It's going to be in every podcast moving forward, and it's something I'm using in ghostwriting interviews now too. And that is to conclude the interview by asking, is there anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Thank you. Yeah, that question comes from my belief that I miss things. I can always be better, or I believe that my success is based on my collaboration with other people. So I don't feel like anything I've accomplished, I've done on my very own. Oh, Charlie, I want you to know that your demeanor and the way you conducted this and everything about this has been one of the finest I've experienced. And I've been as open with you and personal as I've been with anyone, because you brought this out in me. So don't shortcut yourself when you think of interviewing, because you did a great job with me.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'd say for those who, are listening and can't see it at home, I'd say you have an unbroken record of making both parties cry.
Thanks. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks as always. I'll be in touch, and
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks for including me. It was much more than I expected, and this for me has been a rare, fulfilling interview. So thank you for that.
And I'll just repeat it for the folks at home. The book is In the Name of the Children, an FBI agent's relentless pursuit of America's worst predators. And one thing that's probably worth mentioning to your point about personal pronouns at the end and I statements versus you statements, and this, I hope this isn't a spoiler, but the chapters in your book are the names of
Yeah.
of kids from your cases. And even I remember when I read that I think in the introduction, and then I saw it in action, and that was a pretty it really has an impact.
Charlie, can I say one more thing about the book?
Please.
The book, I'm not an author, and the book is not a reflection of me being an author or seeking to write a book. That book, when I retired, I was in bed for 6 months. And when I started getting stronger and recovering from all this, Lori asked me to write my story for my sons. So I did it as a very long letter to my sons. That book is the letter I wrote.
Love that. Jeff, thanks again. This has
Thank you, Charlie.
been a pleasure. And thanks for your work and your service.
Feel free to keep in contact.
I will. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Jeff's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.